is shortly after 12, and so I just want to introduce Dev to everybody. He is a graduate student. He's been with us for, I guess, 2 years now, right? Yeah, just about 2 years, maybe a smidge more than 2 years. And so today he's going to be presenting his the prospectus for his PhD research. I think it's a really exciting topic, and I know all of you physical oceanographers out there are going to be very excited about this topic. Coastal marine heat waves and their interactions with landfall cyclones. And so there are ecological implications for all this. And I think Dev's going to hopefully do a very nice job of presenting some of the reasons why you all might be interested in this topic, even if you don't care about the physics. Yeah, I'm happy to have Dev present his prospectus research. And if you guys have thoughts or comments, Dev will be excited to take constructive criticism and feedback. All right, guys. We'll see you all in 40 minutes, 45 minutes.
Probably, yeah. Thanks, Brian. So, good morning, all. I will be presenting my prospectus today, which on the topic exploring the dynamics of coastal ocean extremes, which I will be focusing on two major extreme events, the marine heat waves and landfalling cyclones. And as an overview for my PhD plans, I divided my research into 4 different chapters. This chapter 1 will focus on the coastal surface marine heat wave, while the second chapter is kind of continuation, which I will be working on the subsurface marine heat wave. And on the third chapter, I'll be focusing on the interaction between the marine heat waves and the tropical storms. And on the fourth chapter, looking at sort of the large scale variability, how it dominates the strength of the coastal ocean extreme events. And I will be going in details for each of these chapters. But before that, let me go through some of the background information. So in this picture, you might see all the extreme events that you might have heard or seen in your life, and from drought or floods or wildfires, tornadoes, and we know them individually, but why do we call them as extreme events? So I found this more concise definition from NOAA, which tells us at a given time or place, when the weather or climate condition exceed sort of a threshold in the upper and lower ends of the historical measurement, we term them as an extreme event. And usually we set the threshold in the highest and lowest of 5 to 10% of the historical measurements. And typically there are 2 major extreme events, like weather-related extreme events, which are short-lived, and it contains events like heat waves, tornadoes, cyclones, and floods. And then you have sort of a long-term extreme events, which is called climate-related extreme events. And it is more of an accumulation of several weather events happening in a season or longer, such as if we have a like below normal rainfall season, then the months followed that will be experiencing severe drought. Now, let me take you to 2 examples. One is the first one is sort of heat wave watch that you might see in the summer in the Mobile. And the second one is sort of imaginary, which is a sudden snowfall in Mobile. And according to the definition from the NOAA, we kind of can explain the heat wave as an extreme event because we have long-term measurements of this temperature, and if it exceeds the threshold, we can say it's a heat wave. But what about the sudden snowfall? We don't have a snowfall measurement in Mobile, right? So is that an extreme event? Actually, they both are. So what's the difference? So there are 2 approaches we have to define the extreme event. One is based on the threshold I explained earlier, and the second one is based on the probability of occurrence. So if it's like the snowfall happening in the Mobile, which is very rare to occur here, and when it happens with high intensity. So that kind of events also considered as extreme events. So this is much more like going into the definitions of each of these approaches. And the first method is the probability method, which is we look at the probability of one event to occur at a given location, and if it's like less than 10%, and when the event happens, it will be on high intensity. So Some of the examples is drought that we experience in Mississippi or Louisiana, which usually a place where you get a lot of precipitation. And on the other hand, if you get a heavy rain in Nevada, which is a very dry area, that is also considered as a extreme event. And then you have like another example, which is a storm making landfall in California, which is extremely rare, like once in 100 years. So that type of event is often we use the probability method to define. And the next one is, as I explained, is based on the threshold. And here is an example of the temperature. And you can see the probability of occurrence, and based on that given location, it will be like distributed like in a graph like this, and the midpoint will be the climatological mean. And if it happens to be in the extreme points, you could consider them as extreme events. And if it's like above 90% threshold, it will be a heat wave. On the other hand, if it's below the 10% threshold, it will be a cold wave, or that is when you get the freeze warning and all things. And let me focus on the two events that is my interest, the marine heat waves and tropical cyclone. And since we have that heat wave term in the marine heat wave, we know that it's going to be an extreme event. But what about the tropical cyclone? So as I mentioned earlier, if the storm is making a landfall in the west coast of US, it will be an extreme event. But what about the Gulf Coast? We see tropical storms every year, right? So for the Gulf Coast, if the tropical storm is making a rapid change before making landfall, it will be an extreme event. Even though all the tropical storms are associated with other extreme events like flood or extreme precipitation, storm surge, etc. For my particular study, I'll be focusing on the storms that is making rapid changes in the intensity. So let's look at what they are and what their impacts are. And this is the picture of Hurricane Idalia making landfall in the Florida coast this year, which is also when rapid intensification. And the first one is marine heat wave. And by definition, the marine heat waves are defined as when the sea surface temperature or observed temperature exceed a certain threshold, which is 90% most of the time, for at least 5 consecutive days. And here I mentioned observed temperature, because if you are looking at bottom marine heat wave, the temperature we are using will be bottom temperature. So we still use the same definition for that also. And in the above, I showed a picture of a typical time series when the marine heat wave happens, and you can see like the earlier time you get those heat spikes for shorter time, and later it starts to kind of warming up and reach the peak intensity. And once it reaches the peaking intensity, start cooling and reaches its declining stage. And one thing I forgot to explain in this picture is the blue line here is the climatology, and the red line is our threshold, the 90th percentile. So once it exceeds and stays there for more than 5 days with less than 2 days gaps, it will be a marine heat wave. So the key properties here to look for is one, the onset of the marine heat wave, second, the peak where it reaches the maximum intensity, and the declining stage. And we sort of have several metrics that we use. And one of them is the rate of onset, which gives us the warming trend. And then we have the declining rate, which gives us the cooling rate of the marine heat wave. And based on how much it exceeds from the 90th percentile, it is divided into sort of different categories like strong, moderate, severe categories. And that is the sort of the color is representing here. And the main thing I will be using is the duration and the intensity, but based on the purpose, I have to use the other metrics also. Now, what drives the marine heat wave? The major factor that drives the marine heat wave is the atmospheric process. So we need that heating happening in the ocean surface to kind of form the marine heat wave. So for that, we need to get the maximum of that's solar energy, right? So for that, we need to have the reduced cloud cover, which is often associated with high pressure moving into that area. So here I have shown the recent weather picture at October 30. You can see the high pressure is bringing a lot of that cold air here, but and you see like cloud-free conditions during that days. During late summer or fall, this high pressure system will also bring warm air from the continent. So that is really important. And another thing is you need to have weak winds and high humidity, which is reduces the latent and sensible heat loss from the ocean surface. So it contains that heating happening in the ocean surface without losing. So, and another thing to note here is that often the marine heat wave are associated with atmospheric heat wave also, which is defined when the air temperature exceeds the 90th percentile for consecutive 3 days. And we told right now like about the atmospheric process. Let's see about the oceanic conditions. And you can see there is a lot of factors, oceanic process that helps the marine heat wave to develop or decline. And the major contributors are like the upwelling and downwelling and advection, mixing, etc., happening in these areas. And here I am showing a picture of the focal time series, which is a mooring that diesel maintains in the offshore Alabama. As you can see, it has sort of like the upwelling, downwelling condition occurring in this time. So if you see, this is like a, can you see my point? Yeah. So this is kind of a downwelling condition. You could see how the surface heat is transported to the subsurface layers, and you have seen the vertical transport due to the upwelling, like bringing that cold water here. And this is the place where the mixing happens. And all these process determines how the heat is distributed into the layers of the ocean. And then you have the properties defining the stratification, etc. in the ocean. So in terms of the coastal ocean, the primary reason is this: having this shallow water structure, it helps to the ocean to enable like the fast response to the atmospheric heat wave and the atmospheric condition. And also in the coastal ocean, you have limited supply of cold water reserve, and if it has to come from the offshore side if it has to like affect the system. And another thing is like when you have like weak winds happening, you will have reduced mixing. So that is also another process that kind of helps the marine heat waves. And the next thing is sort of the large scale process, which controls both the atmospheric and oceanic conditions. And they are the El Nino, La Nina, or like North Atlantic Oscillation, sort of large scale variabilities. And a lot of the times they are controlled by the atmospheric variations in the global ocean. But in the coastal ocean particularly, they are often kind of mediated through the variations in precipitation or snowmelt, which influence the river discharge, which in turn reflects in the freshwater discharge in the coastal ocean. So what are the impacts? So this is the part where you guys are interested in. So what are the implications of marine heat wave? So as you know, when a terrestrial heat wave happens, we all are stressed, but we have the air conditioning to go, right? But in the ocean, we don't have that air conditioning. So all the organism will be under stress, and they have to either migrate or just live with it. So with that marine heat wave happening, there will be a lot of ecological impact, including coral bleaching or habitat loss of seagrass or kelp forest, then sort of oyster mortalities and hypoxia. So there is like many research happening on related to ecology and marine heat wave. And these are some of the major events globally that has associated with the marine heat wave. So it includes like some of the examples include the coral mortalities in East Asia as well as in Australia, and then we have a lot of fisheries loss happening in our east and west coast. So these are some of the examples that I can show you for the ecological impacts. So why am I interested? So it has to be with physical impact, right? So in terms of the ocean physics, I'm interested particularly in marine heat waves because the extreme heat content associated with the marine heat wave favors the storm intensification. And let's look at the tropical cyclone, which I don't need much of the introduction for people in the Gulf Coast because every year we deal with that. But I have sort of put those important points here. And tropical cyclones are like low pressure systems forming in the tropical and subtropical warm waters, which is characterized by strong rotating winds, convective cloud bands, and thunderstorms. And it is categorized based on maximum winds to tropical depression, tropical storm, hurricane, and major hurricane. But for my research, I am particularly interested in tropical storm and the hurricane on major hurricane status because that is when it will have a lot of that large scale organization. And what are the impacts? Also, I don't need to explain. It will be associated with severe tornadoes, floods, storm surge, lot of casualties, property loss. So this is the particular process I am really interested in where it intensifies. So in order to characterize the rapid intensification, we use the maximum sustained wind, which is kind of the wind observed in the outer edge of this eye wall. And when it changes at least 30 knots in 24-hour period, we term that as sort of rapid intensification. But right now we have seen cases of rapid intensification which goes beyond that, right? Like 30 knots, like right now it's like 100 knots in 24-hour period in case of Hurricane Otis, which I will show you later. And based on the studies so far, the warmer water like above 28 degrees Celsius typically favors this intensification. But keep in mind that the atmospheric conditions also need to be favorable for the intensification. And in the Gulf of Mexico, especially the hurricane peak hurricane season starts from August 1st to November 1st, which is the period I am really interested in because the marine heat wave during peak hurricane season will be important for the rapid intensification. And this is an example of the recent example of Hurricane Otis making landfall in the western coast of Mexico. And you can see people are really talking about forecasting issues like why it was too fast for the forecast. And the figure below is showing sort of why they are saying that. So these are the sort of forecast models, how it predicted. And this is kind of how it went. So it suddenly went to from like a cat, like tropical storm to kind of cat 4 storm in like 24-hour, which was like really intense. And none of the forecast models actually predicted that. So they actually had to go in there using the aircraft hunter program, and then only they realized it's going beyond their hand. And now for Gulf of Mexico, as I mentioned, the hurricanes are kind of home for hurricanes. So next, let's go to my first chapter where I will be talking or like researching on the surface marine heat wave and the importance of surface marine heat wave. As I mentioned earlier, it is favorable, makes a favorable conditions for the intensification. And in the figure above is a case of 2019 marine heat wave. As you can see, the Gulf of Mexico was very warm, especially like 31, 32 degrees Celsius, which is so hot for any cases of rapid intensification, especially if you consider as a, like the marine heat wave perspective, you could see the maximum intensity of this marine heat wave are happening in the shelves of Gulf of Mexico. So that is really matters because one, before making landfall, it has to go through this shelf where it's intensively warm. So we don't have much time to prepare. So that is why if a marine heat wave happening in the shelf is very important. Another thing is like, since as I mentioned, the shallow nature of the shelf, so any atmospheric conditions can have big implication for the marine heat waves to develop and as well as to decay. And another reason easy to study the surface marine heat wave is we have the long-term satellite products, and most of the forecast model use them as a forcing. So analyzing those data set and finding the cases of surface marine heat wave have like lot of impacts in terms of the research. And then you have sort of the ecological importance, as I mentioned earlier. Now, for the Gulf of Mexico, the X factor here is, especially in the continental shelf, is the Mississippi River. It brings a lot of fresh water from the northern part of the US to the south, and which includes snowmelt, precipitation, and all the watershed waters. And it brings a lot of fresh water in the shelf and reducing the salinity in the surface, which is important because when you have sort of the freshwater discharge happening, it stratifies the surface layers and really influence how the heat is kind of trapped or how it is interacting with the atmosphere. And one of the thing is most of the ocean model use climatological river discharge, and it can underestimate or overestimate the role of salinity. For example, in 2019, this is the observed river discharge, and this is sort of the climatological picture. So if suppose a model uses this kind of climatological values there, it can really underestimate this much water coming into the shelf. So my first chapter will focus on quantitatively and qualitatively analyzing the surface marine heat wave in the shelves of Gulf of Mexico, especially during peak hurricanes, with sub research including how the river discharge or surface salinity influence the properties of marine heat wave and how well the ocean models perform in such cases and what are the localized impacts. For the second chapter, I will be focusing on the coastal subsurface marine heat wave, which is the marine heat wave happening in the subsurface layers. And why it is important? Because the vertically integrated heat content is really important in case of storm intensification, because when you have that shallow water, the amount of heat that is needed for the hurricane or tropical storm to intensify is really limited. So whatever we have or whatever the coastal ocean have, it has to be huge. So the vertical heat content is very important. And another thing, as I mentioned earlier, the access to the cold water is limited by bathymetry. So the offshore water has to come into the coastal ocean for any change in that heat content. And it's also react with the atmospheric conditions very fast. So sort of the heat content variation is very important. And another thing is very important is like, we cannot detect that using the satellite data. We need the model or observation data set. So, and most of the time the model performance varies based on location, especially if the model is kind of set for global use, and the regional models also may underestimate based on how they are set up. And here I'm showing an example of the 2019 again, which shows from focal data how the subsurface marine heat wave is happening, and which I will go through in a couple of slides later. But this is a case of another subsurface and bottom marine heat wave happening. And in 2019, unlike the subsurface, like surface marine heat wave, the subsurface marine heat wave were controlled by a couple of factors, including the mixing and advection. And wind events during that period was primarily important to control how the upwelling or downwelling occurring and sort of mixing happening. And in 2019, it developed from a surface marine heat wave to an extended full water column marine heat wave, then decaying the surface layers and sort of staying there as subsurface and bottom trapped marine heat wave, and later going into the fall transition stage. And here, the focal data was key to understand because it wasn't detected until we looked at the focal data and we realized how the advection and mixing played an important role. Now, in the case of 2019, it was a compounding event, which means there is series of events that controls the development of this marine heat wave. First, it started as an atmospheric heat wave at the surface, and which led to a surface marine heat wave during like this time period right here. So these vertical lines here represent the timing of the marine heat wave. For example, the green lines indicate the atmospheric heat waves, and sort of the blue lines indicate kind of surface marine heat wave, and then you have the purple, which indicate the extended or depth average marine heat wave. And after that, that first surface marine heat wave, a tropical storm impacted our area and sort of mixing happening, and it bring all the surface warm water to the subsurface. And once the storm passed through it, the atmospheric heat wave again started, which leading to another surface marine heat wave. And after that, this subsurface also responded to that with marine heat wave happening. And finally, another storm again came. It mixed up the water column. It decayed first the surface, but the subsurface stayed there for a while. But after that, it went to the fault transition. So my second chapter will be focusing on processes that drive the subsurface marine heat wave and identify the cases of compounding event and how they are evolved and what are the processes that governs. And moving on to third chapter is basically the title, like where it interacts with the tropical cyclone on how they are kind of related and why they are important. As I mentioned, it can really favor the tropical cyclone rapid intensification. Here's the two case for an example. The first case is an intensification of typhoon, which we can refer as hurricane in our area, which went rapid intensification in the East China Sea in 2020. And in the figure, if you see these X marks here actually represent the areas of marine heat wave. And this is sort of the state when changes from a typhoon to super typhoon category. And you can see when it passes through that marine heat wave, it really favors that intensification. And then also, they also mentioned how the salinity played a role in the surface stratification along with the marine heat wave. And another case is our own DC published in 2020, which is in Nature, like how the sort of the marine heat wave could have been made a favorable condition to the intensification of Hurricane Michael in 2018. And this research is particularly important because it talks about how the compounding events impacts in our area particularly. And in terms of the importance, as I mentioned earlier, the shelf transit time for a tropical storm in most of our shelf is 72 hours, which is almost 3 days. And we only get 3 days to prepare before making landfall. And during this time, any sort of intensification is particularly important because if it's get intensified, we may like other sort of areas must be evacuated and all those things happening in that time period. And especially before making it landfall, we need to have a high forecast skill. And so that high forecast skill is needed for kind of preventing the damage and evacuation. And you can see how the case of the Mexico happened in like few weeks ago. And another thing is like it is also associated with hypoxias and HABs, so that research is also important. And during my first year, I focused on some of the studies, and those earlier results indicated both rapid intensification and weakening occurring in warm shelf condition, which we don't usually see. Like we expect them to go intensification in a warmer condition, but weakening also happening in that warm conditions. So my idea is like the intensification or weakening happening in likely to be influenced by other factors, including the atmospheric condition. So whenever I am dealing with sort of the interaction studies, I have to consider them also. And we also need to important to determine the conditions which it favors rapid intensification and sort of deviate from that relationship. So that is my objective for this study. So identify the cases of potential relationship between the marine heat waves and how it influenced the rapid changes in tropical storm, and especially in Gulf of Mexico, and identify the cases that deviate from relationship. And this is like a recent example of how Hurricane Idalia, which I showed the picture earlier, went rapid intensification. And if you see Gulf of Mexico sea surface temperature, it was very warm. We are lucky that it didn't pass through the northern Gulf, went to the Florida, but sort of the marine heat wave in this happening in this area really influenced or may have influenced the intensification of the Hurricane Idalia. So the last chapter will focus on sort of the large scale picture, how the large scale climate variability is controlling sort of the nature of these coastal extreme events. And this is sort of like a preliminary picture that I can show you. This is like average picture of the whole Gulf of Mexico. So the first picture is like the SST anomalies over years, and this is over like the month. And you can see like the trends in the sea surface anomalies and sort of leading to the marine heat wave, particularly during this time and in recent years, especially. And the second one is kind of detrended to avoid the long-term warming effect. And you can see sort of marine heat wave as well as the cold spell happening almost every month, every year. And this is the picture on the right is actually showing sort of the time series of that events. And you can see the trend is going up, which is also associated with the long-term global warming. And you can see recently we are seeing many marine heat wave happening. And when you remove the long-term warming, you can see the marine heat wave even happening in the past time also. So it is important that we study both the long-term warming trends as well as sort of recent trends in the marine heat wave. Keep in mind that this is a basin-wide picture. When you look at the coastal ocean, it may be different. And then another thing is like you have these climate modes happening in interannual and decadal time scale. As you know, like these sea surface temperature are modulated through the variations in atmospheric condition, which also due to kind of this interannual and decadal variabilities like El Nino, La Nina, and like North Atlantic oscillations. And in global scale, you can see how it is impacted. This is a picture of severe marine heat waves happening associated with different El Nino and La Nina conditions. And these blue lines, these two actually represent like severe La Nina and moderate La Nina cases, whereas these two color bars kind of represent the strong and severe El Nino time periods. And if you look at sort of the Gulf of Mexico here, it's mainly modulated by El Nino, but since it's a global picture, we cannot really differentiate how it impacted the shelves of Gulf of Mexico. And so my objective will be focusing on how the large scale variabilities kind of influence the coastal extreme, especially as I mentioned earlier in the beginning, like often this kind of influence is deviated through the changes in like the snow melt, precipitation, or like watershed changes in the Mississippi area, and it may be due to that. So does that influence is mediated through that kind of conditions or directly through the atmospheric conditions? And another thing is like, which is the dominant climate variability in our region, whether it's El Nino, La Nina, or other sort of variabilities, and what are the long-term trends in coastal ocean. So that's my objective of the final chapter. And in order to study this, I use the different types of data set, and I don't have field observations. So I have to really depend on publicly available data set. And that includes the focal that we maintain in the offshore Alabama. And then you have the NOAA buoys and Argo floats. And then, of course, you have the satellite products from different agencies. And you have other variables also, like salinity and wind also you can estimate from satellite. And another thing is for subsurface kind of studies, I need ocean reanalysis, which currently I'm using Glorious Ocean Reanalysis, which is seems to be pretty good working in coastal region. And then another thing is NAR, which is an atmospheric reanalysis to see how the atmospheric conditions are varying. For any studies related to the storm, I'm using the best track available from 1982 present. So that's my data. That concludes my presentation. And these are kind of the summary. And my research is, as I went through, I focus on two major coastal extremes, marine heat waves and landfalling storms. And my study area is Gulf of Mexico. But if it helps, I may look into other basins also. And for the first chapter, I'll be looking at surface marine heat wave. Second chapter will be focusing on subsurface marine heat wave. And third chapter, relationship between marine heat wave and tropical cyclone. And finally, looking at how the coastal extremes vary with climate variability. And I will be using observation, satellite, and reanalytic. Thanks.